So my friend and I one night decided to smoke around the early morning hours, which was about 1 a.m., and it was at this cemetery. Before I get right into it, we were not literally in the cemetery, but on a cliff that has a view of the cemetery. Anyways, we're at the cliff, and we began to start smoking, and started to laugh and daze off into the bright moonlight. As we're dazing off, I look to the right of me, which is basically a dirt trail covered with bushes and trees, and I see this little dark figure, almost like it was a shadow, but I can barely make out the clothes of this figure. As I'm looking, and my eyes start to adjust, my heart just sank, and my body just locked into place after my heart started pounding out of my chest. At the time, my friend was on his phone, so he wasn't paying attention, thinking I'm on my phone, since he's not facing me. This goblin, or whatever the hell it was, started to creep up on us, without even moving its legs, almost just kind of hovering towards me, which also gave me a panic attack. After a brief second of me panicking, I turn over and point to my friend in the direction that the goblin was. Of course, my friend paid no attention, and I look to my right again, and this little creature just hovers back into the dark end of the trail, and I never saw it again. What the hell was that thing? In my life, we've encountered this little creature more than once. The first time was 22 years ago, when my mom was pregnant with my sister. She just had a fight with my dad, and it was so bad she had to leave the house and slept at an old lady's house around the corner. She was about 7 or 8 months pregnant, so the old lady, fearing my mom could go into labor because of the stress, stayed with her in the same room at the back of the house. They both say it was around midnight, and they were about to fall asleep, when they saw a shadow looking through the window. They stayed still until they heard the person walking away. My mom says she thought it was my dad looking for her, so they went to the window just to make sure. But what they saw was not my dad. They both say they saw a little man, very small, covered in black hair, with a small tail, walking away. Now, they thought it could have been a monkey, even though there isn't a zoo in that city, much less monkeys. But that was the only logical explanation that they could come up with, until they saw this thing turn around. They describe it as having a completely human-looking face, like being a man, the only difference being its size, like a 5-year-old kid, but chubby, and covered all over in that dark hair. It stood there, looking at them for maybe 5 seconds, and then it ran away. The next encounter happened 4 or 5 months later, at my grandma's house. This is where we lived. They'd built a room behind the main house, and my sister was sleeping in her crib in my parents' room. I was with my grandma and my aunt in the main house. My aunt says my mom came to see if I needed something. I was 2 years old at the time. And she asked my aunt to keep an eye on me, because she was going to take a nap. My aunt said sure, and my mom left. My aunt says maybe 2 minutes passed by, when she clearly heard the sound of coins coming from my parents' room. I should say my sister had a sweater with tiny coins attached to it, so my aunt thought that maybe my sister was awake, and went to grab her so my mom could sleep. She says what she saw walking into that room was the same thing that my mom and that old lady had seen. My mom was laying in the bed, completely asleep, and next to my sister's crib was that creature, and it was trying to grab my sister. She screamed to my mom, and the being ran away back into the backyard. She picked up my sister and said my mom was still sleeping, and she had to push her for her to wake up. My mom didn't tell anyone about her encounter because she thought that night she and the old lady were just tired, and they saw something under the moonlight, which wasn't the best illumination. Yet my aunt described this thing exactly as my mom did. Small, chubby, covered in that thick, dark hair, standing on 2 legs, with a tail and a man's face. One other thing I should add is my dad and 2 other neighbors ran after that thing They heard it running, but they never found it. After that, we never saw it again. What could this thing have been? A goblin? A troll? A demon? Any answers would be appreciated. This happened to me about 4 years ago when I was coming home from work one day. It was around 6 o'clock, and in the winter months in Canada, by this time it's already dark. As I was driving home, I was just passing by the streetlights that were already on, thinking nothing of my day, except the one unusual thing that I did encounter. As I was leaving my work, I saw a little boy behind me in my rearview mirror. I'd say he was about 50 feet behind me in the middle of the parking lot. It was kind of strange, but I didn't pay much attention to it. Then, as I was driving home, I saw the same kid. He was dressed the same. It was about 3 blocks from where my work is, and he was just staring at me as I drove by. I thought, that's weird. How did that kid get all that way ahead of me? I was driving the speed limit, and I doubt the kid could run that fast. Or that somebody could pick him up and drop him off in a different location quicker than I was driving. I had a slight chill, and I tried not to think much about it. I only live 7 minutes away from my work, so it doesn't take me that long to get back home. When I was about 2 blocks away from my house, I saw the kid again. This time, he was under a street lamp, so I got a better look at this kid. And to my surprise, it wasn't a kid at all. In Mexico, we call these creatures duendes. They're usually small fairy-like creatures with the appearance of an old man. Their heights do vary. I myself have never seen one to be the size of a child. But this thing looked exactly like an old man. As I drove past him to turn the corner, I was freaking out. At this point, I just wanted to get home, especially if this thing was following me. As I was on approach to turn to the last corner of my house, there he was again. I slammed on my brakes because he was right in front of me in the street. I was ready to run him over, but I was frozen in place. He walked past me and gave me the most evil grin I'd ever seen. As soon as he was on the other side of the street, I gunned it home. But I took one final glance in my rear view. If he was still behind me, I wasn't stopping at home. But whatever it was, this fairy creature, this duende, it was just gone. They vanished into thin air. It wasn't on the other side of the street. It wasn't in the middle of the street. It wasn't running down the street. It was just gone. I didn't care where it was. I was so frightened, I got home, got out of my car, looked around to see if it was nearby, and gunned it into my house. I was fortunate enough not to see it again, but I made sure to look down both ways of the street, just in case it was coming towards me. I locked the door behind me, I closed the curtain, and I tried to forget what I saw. Even my wife knew something had spooked me. I didn't tell her till the following day. I didn't want to scare her at that time. I hope, if this was a duende, even if it wasn't, if it was some other kind of tiny fairy creature, I hope I never see it again. Living in Ireland my whole life, I've had quite a few run-ins with fairies. When I was about 7, I was staring out my back window from the upstairs landing in my old house. I was mesmerized as I looked out. Usually, what I would see were the backyards of other people's houses, and this great big gray building, which was the handball alley. I squeezed my eyes closed and opened again, because in the usual place of the surroundings was just fields of beautiful green grass, soft rocks dotted around pools of blue water, and flowers upon flowers swaying in what appeared to be a gentle wind. It was very strange, to say the least. I had never seen this before, I thought to my young self. And then I noticed movement in my back garden. What I saw next startled me even more than the vision that I was already seeing. Sitting in our old flower bed was the man the size of a baby doll. He was wearing green trousers, a waistcoat, and a jacket. And what always stuck with me were his shoes. Black as the ace of spades, with two big shiny gold buckles. He was sitting there, looking at his shoes, when his head bolted up. He looked right at me. Then he smiled and vanished. The view behind my back garden turned back into its mundane self. To this day, I don't know what happened. I don't know how it happened. I can't make heads or tails of what happened. But I'm glad I got my first and only leprechaun experience. The second encounter I had was when I was on holiday with the Girl Guides. For you American folk, the Girl Guides are like the Scouts. It was actually in the Isle of Man that was overseas. We went on a little tour of the Isle, and we went to this little shop selling trinkets and souvenirs. I remember specifically picking out some nice tea towels for my grannies back home. As we packed our goods safely back in our bags, we headed on the bus back to the village we were staying in. Our bus slowed down as we came to a bridge. Our guide leader pointed out to a sign, and we all rushed to the window of the bus to read it. On the sign it said something along the lines of, "Beware, you're about to cross a ferry bridge. Some people have experiences. Some of their items and their vehicles had been taken, or tricks had been played on them." Everyone on the bus just laughed, except for me. I had already known of the fairies, because of that experience I had with the leprechaun. So on we go over the bridge. It just felt like going over any old bridge. Everyone laughed. Then, we went on about our journey back into the village. When we arrived back to the dorms we were staying in, I opened my bag to see my purchases that was neatly tucked under some old day stuff. Well, what I'd seen next made my eyes drop. There in that bag was nothing. The tea towels were gone. Now, I specifically sat with that bag on my knee on the bus ride home. And who in their right mind would steal 2 tea towels? They were like £1 each. Nothing exciting, just a little bit of fun. I was then drawn back to the sign of the fairies over the bridge. I couldn't help but laugh and think of the thought that my tea towels were nicked by the bridge fairies. My partner once told me a story about when he encountered the fairy folk. Where he lived, there was mountains, water, cows, sheep, one church, and no shops. He always described it as a great place for the setting of a horror movie at night, because it's that quiet. Neighbors were very far apart, so the chance of neighbors hearing you scream is very slim. Now that you get the idea of how secluded this place is, I'll begin to tell you the tale that he told me. 'Twas 3 a.m., the witching hour, and my partner was lifted out of his bed by the sounds of laughing and giggling. He said to himself, "My mother and father are out cold. Who's making that noise?" He strained his ears to listen, and what he heard next was amazing. A drumming, a bit of fiddling, the pipes calling, and the important part, hearing great Irish music, was the singing and laughter out of the people enjoying it. He got up to see what the commotion was, and he walked out around his bungalow house. Remember, his parents were still sound asleep. He walks to the front door. No, nothing. Peace and quiet, just like he'd expected. He walks to the back door and hears the sound. He follows the sound and is led to the edge of his garden that backs into a field with a mound. He's shown his torch. Nothing. He felt like the noise was coming beneath him, so he got down and pressed his ears to the ground. Lo and behold, the sound was coming from the underground. The general direction for the party and the music was in the small mound, or hump, in the field. He freaked out and skidded back into the house and leapt into his bed. It was a couple weeks later. I was reading a book on Irish paranormal and fairy stories, and lo and behold, the one place that continuously mentions fairy sightings was the area where my partner lived. What he thinks happened was one night the fairy folk were having a party, and since they live in that mound, that's where all the guests were meeting. Thank you for listening.